Is anybody here telling me not to start? Okay, good. So this week's Torah portion is Vayera, and of course the story in it that I'm going to focus on is a story that I very often avoid because it's a very, very difficult story, and that is the story in chapter 22, the story of the binding of Isaac. And I would just like to introduce by saying that I will probably, hopefully, give a few insights, but by no means will I be able to answer the questions, the many, many questions that come up from this story, from this chapter. But I do think we can gain a little bit of insight, and that's really what I'm aiming for. So first of all, before we get to that, let's set the background. And the background really is in chapter 18. The Torah portion begins with these people, these men who are actually angels, who come to visit Abraham, and there's an whole interchange between them, and then they leave. Now, while they're there, they inform Abraham that he's going to have a son, and the name will be Yitzchak. And he's already been told this before, but this is, I don't know, a more official telling. It's also, from what we can see, the first time Sarah learns about it. So we are here promised that Abraham is promised that he will have a son, Isaac, and it's that son that will actually be his heir, the heir to all the promises that God had explained to him. After these angels leave, there begins a conversation between God and Abraham as to what's going to go on in Sodom, which is a whole nother subject that we don't have time to get to today. But I just want to focus on three verses 17, 18, and 19 in chapter 18. And here, verse 17 begins, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" And I think that's just an amazing statement because it indicates God's sense of intimacy with Abraham. He's about to destroy Sodom, and he is going to make sure he tells Abraham, because he says, I can't hide it from Abraham, which is such an amazing expression of that connection, a unique connection between God and Abraham. And then he goes on to say, why is it, or what about Abraham is so special? Since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all of the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him. And then why is it? And again, this verse 18 basically just repeats the promise that we have seen already, that God says to Abraham, he will have children, the children will inherit the land, but the land here is less discussed. And through this nation, through Abraham's children, the whole world will be blessed. So this just repeats that. But here it says why. Why is it that Abraham has been selected to be this person? For I have, and here I'm going to have a dispute with the translation. The word in Hebrew is yida'ativ, which means literally I knew him, or I know him, okay? And yet here the translation says, for I have singled him out. And I don't think that's a correct translation. I'd like to go back to the literal. For I know him, that he will instruct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and what is righteous and just, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. So here we have not only an idea of why God promised Abraham, because he sees in Abraham, he knows him well. And we see that intimacy and that knowledge in the previous verse. How can I hide anything from Abraham? So God now is attesting the fact that he knows Abraham is a person who will be instructing his children in righteousness and justice in order to follow the ways of God, okay? And that becomes a predicate for the promises. In other words, God says, I will fulfill the promises I made to Abraham because he is going to be instructing his children to become this nation that follows God and that spreads justice and righteousness. So I think that this tells us something very, very important about the nature of the promise and how important Abraham and Abraham's connection with his children, with his progeny, the connection of Abraham and how his children will become a nation, how critical that is for not just the technical transmission of the promise, but actually becomes the essence of what the promise is all about. One more piece that I want to have here as background is that we've already had a situation where since Abraham receiving this promise, he has had two possible heirs that have been rejected. Initially, Lot, his nephew, he takes him along with him to the land of Israel. His assumption is, well, if he doesn't have children, he has a nephew, his brother's son. So Lot will be the heir to these promises. But Lot, of course, is separated from him at his own choice and goes off to the east. Ishmael then is a son of Abraham, certainly somebody that Abraham sees as a possible heir, but he too is sent from the home. And this is something that Sarah initiates, but that God confirms. He says, listen to your wife. Remember that, men, listen to your wife. They know what they're talking about. But anyway, it's very clear that God has specifically confirmed that this is what should happen. So we have Lot out of the way, Ishmael out of the way. We have now Isaac, who's already born, and the way is paved for Isaac then to be this carrier of the promise and to enable all of this to happen. And then what happens? We reach chapter 22, and we have a situation that in light of all this makes absolutely no sense. Verse 2, God is saying to him, and he said, take your son, your only son, who you love, Isaac, and go forth with him to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a sacrifice on one of the mountains, which I will tell you, or I will point to you. How could this possibly be? And this, of course, raises so many questions. We finally got an heir. We have a promise. The promise is dependent on progeny that will continue the work of Abraham. And this is something that God has made intrinsic to the promise. How could this happen? It sounds like God is reneging on his promise. Abraham has only one son. That son is already a grown man. And there's no way, I mean, if it was rather miraculous that Abraham had a son at 100, he certainly is not going to have a son at 120. I mean, this is gone. So how, it seems he's reneging on his promise. How can God command child sacrifice? This seems to be against every principle that it's essentially what the Bible is bringing to the ancient world. Ancient world, child sacrifice was perfectly acceptable. But here we have a Bible where God says man is created in the image of God. No one man can kill another man. How can it be that God is going to say, sacrifice your children? And I would say, lastly, how can God do this to Abraham? Abraham is so close. He's been so dedicated. He's been so righteous. How can God turn around and literally stab this knife in Abraham's chest? How could this be? And again, as I said when I started off, I don't know that I really have answers to this because these questions are far more fundamental, but I'm going to try to see if we can explore a little bit what we can learn from all of this. Okay. Now, one of the things that, again, we have to keep in mind this initial verse that we talked about, chapter 18, verses 17, 19, where God says, I know Abraham, and that he will be instructing his children and his household after him in the ways of justice and righteousness. And this, of course, brings home this idea of the nation of Israel, who are the descendants of Abraham, are some kind of I don't know, lighthouse or something. Isaiah says a light to the nations. It is some vehicle through which not only the nations are blessed, but how does that blessing come about? It is because the people of Israel have a message. God's message is transmitted to the nations through the people of Israel. And that's something, just as an aside, by the way, that I find when I think about the progression of Jewish history throughout the centuries, many Jews, I'm sure most Jews, would look at that role and kind of mock it. Self-mockery, not mocking God, but just saying nobody is looking at the Jewish people for anything positive. Jews were victims of oppression. Jews were mocked, okay? And one of the things that I find so amazing today, as we are living through this amazing time of restoration of the people of Israel to the land of Israel, just think about what's going on in your newspapers and how Israel is literally in the front pages of newspapers and in the Facebook and the news sites online. Israel is there so much, too much, if you ask me. How many countries, if you think about what's going on today with these new agreements that were signed with the Gulf states and which are now more and more states, it seems, are coming into this kind of thing. Why do they want, why do they want a relationship with Israel? Because people are looking to Israel. Yes, they want our know-how, they want our technology, they want our relationship with the United States. But what's really happening is that Israel's become a place, because the Jews are all back and gathered in Israel, we have the opportunity to really fulfill our destiny that God had first set forth with Abraham, because the world is looking at us. Now, unfortunately, the world can look at us and we can do bad things and not be a very good example. But it gives us the opportunity to truly be an example and to teach. And I look at what we're doing today. Many of you are not Jewish and are Christian or whatever, and you're listening to me teach. I mean, this is amazing. And I think this is part of the vision that God placed on Abraham, that he will be teaching his children, and through him, the world will be blessed. And I think this is really what we are talking about. Anyway, that was just a bit of a digression, but I want to go back and say, okay, so we see how incredibly insane God's commandment is to Abraham to sacrifice his one and only special son. And I asked the following question, or take a look at this. How is he responding to this? How can he possibly absorb this? And the first question I have is, does he really believe it is God talking to him? And if you notice, there is absolutely no question in his mind. He knows it is God. And I was thinking about this, and I remember, I don't know how many of you have ever seen Bill Cosby's clip, Noah, okay? And one of the things he does at the beginning of this, he does this thing, Noah in the ark, and so he goes, God says, Noah, and Bill Cosby says, uh-huh. And he says, go build an ark. And at some point he says, who is this talking? Is this candid camera? Like, who is this? And it's the most logical thing in the world when a person gets a call from God that is telling him to do something weird. It would be most natural to say, well, this is not God talking, right? It's something else, right? Not God. And yet there is absolutely no question from the beginning that Abraham recognizes this God. And of course, scripture tells us, it's God. But Abraham's listening, he has no question that it is God. And we see that, of course, because he obeys in verse 3. So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him two of his servants, son Isaac, and etc. He gets up the next morning and he goes. He just goes. So he clearly believes and understands that this is actually God talking. Okay? Now, another thing is, let's contrast this with just a few chapts earlier, when God said, we quoted this part, will I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And then he tells Abraham he's about to destroy Sodom. And Abraham doesn't say, okay. Abraham argues with God. He says, how can you do such a thing? How can you kill the righteous with the evil? He questions him, he challenges God. Why doesn't Abraham challenge God? And I think here you have an example of an Abraham that has no ego. He challenged God previously because it wasn't about him. He wasn't living in Sodom. He wasn't arguing for his sake. He argued for the sake of justice, okay? And the very fact that God would consider wiping out an entire city where he knew Lot was there, and he was confident that Lot did not deserve to be wiped out. And indeed, Lot and his family are the only ones that are rescued. But he's arguing on a principle, not for himself, not even for, he doesn't say, save Lot. He says, it cannot be that there isn't a single righteous person in Sodom, and you cannot kill righteous people because you want to wipe out a whole city. Here, he has no principle to go on, really, except to say, I don't understand. What is it you're asking of me? How can you be commanding me to sacrifice the only son you just promised you were giving to me, and he was going to be the heir of all your promises? There's an internal contradiction that he has trouble with, but I think maybe because he's so intimately connected, and it's his pain that he maybe doesn't want to argue with God, because maybe he doesn't trust his questioning about it to be objective in the same way that his questioning about Sodom was more objective. And then we go to verse 8, okay? And in verse 8 already, we have a conversation between Isaac and Abraham, and Isaac is already questioning, like, where's the animal? We got the wood and we got the matches and we have, you know, the knife. We have everything we need, but where's the sheep that we're supposed to sacrifice? And Abraham, of course, doesn't want to answer him because it's a very painful answer. But what he answers is very significant. He says, God will show the sheep, okay, for his burnt offering, my son. What is he saying? He's saying, I don't really know, and I'm not going to make up an answer. I'm not going to tell you what God told us. What I am going to tell you is at the end of the day, it is God that has given us that answer. And I think what he's doing here is not only answering Isaac, in Isaac's very technical question, where's the sheep? He's answering himself. He's answering his own conflict where he's saying, this makes no sense. How can I know for a fact that it's God who has commanded me to do this, and I am totally committed to obeying God, but how is it that God could command me to do something? And he's in this cognitive dissonance between these two things, knowing this is God who's commanding and yet not understanding how God could command such a thing that flies in the face of everything that God stands for and everything that God has promised Abraham. And instead of trying to argue this, or instead of trying to figure it out, his answer is, God will show me. God will reveal it to me. It's in God's hands. And if I don't understand it, I don't understand it. But he is basically surrendering this whole situation to God, which is, of course, an amazing submission to God from faith. It's also very, very honest. Okay. It's very honest because he doesn't really understand it. And so he's not going to give an answer. He's going to say, it is God who is going to have to reveal this or make this clear. Or I have to leave this in God's hands. And that, by the way, is something that I think is a major message from this whole thing. Because we as human beings very often encounter situations that we don't understand. There isn't anyone who has gone through or witnessed or learned about the Holocaust, for example, that doesn't question, how could this have happened? How could God have done this? How could have God let this happen? The questions are worded in many different ways. And I think anybody who says they have an answer to that question is, there are no answers to that question. There are maybe ways to understand it. There are ways to gain understanding, to gain wisdom, to come out of the situation with some added value. But to say I have an answer to that question, I can't imagine that any human being has an answer to that question. But what God is giving us, or what Abraham more accurately is giving us in this situation, is a way to handle this and to say, I don't know. I don't understand it. But this is definitely something that God is in charge of, or God is involved with, and therefore I'm just going to have to trust God. And we have this kind of situation in two books in the Bible, in Ecclesiastes and in Job. In Ecclesiastes, because there are a number of philosophical questions going on in that book, that some of them include, how could it be that you have these righteous people who are having a hard time, and you have these people who eat, drink, and be merry all day long, and they're successful and they're doing great? That's a question that's posed in Ecclesiastes. And of course, Job, it poses this huge tragedy of he's lost his wife and he's lost his children, not his wife, he lost his children, he's lost his property, he's lost everything. And at the end of the day, both in Ecclesiastes and in Job, the answer is fear God. It is in God's hands. They don't have answers other than to say, and look at the end of Ecclesiastes, at the end of the day, all has been heard. Fear God, obey his commandments, because that is what man is supposed to do. That is what man is supposed to do. So I think that's part of the message that we're seeing here in this whole thing. After Abraham has passed the test already, he's willing to sacrifice. God stops the sacrifice. We have in verse 22. No, not verse 22. Verse 12, excuse me, verse 12. Okay, first we have the angel saying, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Okay. And this is a statement of God saying to Abraham, making it very clear that this indeed was a test. I mean, we know it was a test because the chapter opens with God put Abraham to a test. He tested Abraham, but now we see that the purpose of this test, as God states it, he was testing Abraham. Was he willing to give up his son? And he says, now I know that you have not withheld your son. You're willing to give up your son. And we say here, you did not withhold your son from me, from God. And pardon?
Sorry, I'm just talking to my daughter.
Okay, so then mute perhaps. Okay, so there's something again very, very personal in what God is saying. You have not withheld your son from me, God, not just me, the fearful God. You have not withheld it from me, the intimate God. The same God, and it's very interesting that God says here, now I know. It very much reflects or echoes the original statement that God made, I know him, I know Abraham. This is a discussion between intimates, between God and Abraham, whereas initially God says, I know that Abraham will be like this with his children and his progeny. And he's a righteous man and God-fearing man. And here he says, now I know that you didn't withhold your son from me. It's so personal, it's so intimate. That this is a sense of what he's looking for, is that Abraham is willing to give what is most precious to him to God, who is most precious to who Abraham is most precious to God. Okay, this sense of intimacy of Abraham with Isaac and moving that to God with whom he is so intimate. And I think there's a sense here that he needed to test Abraham if he's willing to give to God what is most precious to him. And of course, this was the ultimate test. But maybe there's also a different message here that says here, what is God looking for of Abraham? Now, of course, he didn't make him go through with the sacrifice, but he wanted to see if Abraham was willing to go through with it. And I think what this is telling us is that there's some sort of demand from Abraham and from Abraham's children. It's not just the initial statement, I need Abraham and his children to be people who are following the path of the righteous and the just and obey God's commandments. I think here God is adding an extra element. Those children are going to have to be willing to sacrifice. And isn't this really a sort of foreshadowing to what Jewish history was all along? To the fact that, in fact, the Jewish nation has almost from the beginning been required to make sacrifices, terrible sacrifices, and still preserve a faith and a loyalty to God. And this may be part of what our heritage is, that the nations may be blessed through us, but it may be blessed through us, but it's not enough. It's not just the cheery story and Abraham is a great guy and so God's going to give us blessings and going to bless all the world through us. But there's an element of sacrifice that will be there, that has to be there, because ultimately life is not easy. And you have to be willing to stand for your faith and for your principles, and you have to be willing to stand for justice in the face of sacrifice. Otherwise, it is not worth anything. And speaking of this, by the way, if you think about it, this is really what the selection of the Jewish people is about. The Jewish people are selected, but it's not just for hunky-dory. And I'm reminded of that wonderful film, Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye kind of turns to God and his horse is lame and his cow is not very good and he's having all these problems and with his daughters, and he turns to God, he's always talking to God and he says, God, maybe you can choose somebody else for a while, and this is clearly, how we've all seen it. Yeah, chosen, it's not always such a picnic. Chosen very often comes with it, more often than not, comes with terrible pain and terrible sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Anyway, let's move on. Verse 16, to the end of the story. Okay, after this, after God's recognition of what Abraham and his understanding of that Abraham has passed the test, he then repeats the promise. First of all, he says again, by myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one. He says that again. I bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants because you have obeyed my command. And again, he ties this in with the original promise and the original knowledge that God has of Abraham, which we talked about in the beginning. That from Abraham and from Isaac will be this great nation that will be numerous, and they will bring blessing to all the nations of the world. But what we have added here is this element, because you did not withhold your son. In other words, that blessing, that promise is going to be dependent not only on obeying God in general, following the commandments, but the willingness to sacrifice in order to obey those commandments. But again, the question remains when we review all of this, okay, the question still remains. Can we live with these questions? We still don't have a real answer, not a real answer. How is it that God could command this of Abraham? How could Abraham even expect to follow this? And it leaves us in a huge quandary. And I think maybe that the real challenge for us as people of faith is not just, are we willing to sacrifice? Are we willing to follow God's way with faith? But are we willing and able to live with questions? To live with questions and leave it in God's hands. And I don't think this means abandon your intelligence. I believe we have a responsibility to question, and what Abraham showed us, in previous Torah portions, his arguing with God makes it very clear that it is considered a good thing to question. We must continue to use our brain and use our heart and be sensitive to spiritual problems and moral problems. And we must be always questioning, but we will not always have answers. And I think what this story tells us is that we have to find a way to live with the questions. And at the end of the day, we have to be able to adopt Abraham's view and the Bible's view and Ecclesiastes and Job. We have to be able to say, God will show us the sheep. God will enable us to understand it or help us figure this out. Or we may not understand it, but we have to trust that God is in charge and he will take care of the sheep. He will figure it out, whether we understand it or not. And I think that also is very much a part of what this Torah portion is telling us. We have just a couple minutes left before we going to say, and I see there's one question that Abraham tells Sarah about what he was going to. That is a marvelous question. And it's one that the Midrash does address, and that he didn't tell her. And in fact, when this story is over, the immediate next story in chapter 23 is the death of Sarah. And the Midrash connects the two. And the Midrash tells us that it was Sarah discovering what had happened and that Abraham had taken Isaac to sacrifice. And there's different versions of it, whether she found out after she already knew he was alive, or whether at some point she thought he had actually sacrificed. But whatever it was, knowledge of this story is what killed her. And that again is a midrashic explanation. It's not what you can see by just reading the text. It is not mentioned in the text, but there is some kind of reading here that's going on by our sages that are saying this was not a simple situation. He did not tell Sarah, and it created harm and hardship and pain in the entire family. And that's certainly something that we can study at another time. It's a whole different subject, but is definitely something that's worth thinking about. Questioning without trusting God is troubling, 100%. You need to question. But there's no question that if you question within the framework of your faith, you will have an easier time living with your questions. And I think that's really the flip side of this message. Anyway,